Okay, we're going to look at an example of a campaign against a wicked problem related to health, in this case, female genital mutilation and cutting, which is linked to, in the cultures where it's commonly practiced, linked to deeply held beliefs about um, things like purity and honor, tradition. And so this is something that's very, very difficult to um, map with certainty and to identify interventions that are guaranteed to make change. Because we're talking here about not just about legislative procedure or about budgeting, we're talking about people's psychology and cultural identity. So we have to be very careful and very humble about what we know, what we don't know. So looking at a specific campaign coordinated by UNICEF in Sudan, and I'm going to apply some of the mapping techniques to the reports that I read about this campaign. So prior to the campaign, FGM is extremely common in Sudan, more than 9 in 10. Girls subjected to the practice, many at a very young age, although different ethnicities within Sudan and different families within the same community would practice this at different ages. So that in some cases it would be for baby girls, others for adolescent girls at puberty, and still others at the time of marriage or preparation for marriage. And so the theory of change, as I understand it from the UNICEF material, is that this is not the kind of campaign where targeting one or just a few actors will create sustainable change. What we're looking to do in this kind of campaign is to influence collective sentiment in a way that the system as a whole evolves in a healthy way. And this is not something that is merely what an outside perspective would add or would desire, but these are coming from the girls and women in this community who often feel trapped in these in certain practices. So it's how to not to point fingers at people, but how to share information, knowledge in a new way, such that the voices of people who hadn't been heard are heard more, especially the voices of girls who generally have very little power in the situation. So they used the word Salima for this campaign. Salima is a Sudanese word in the local in the national dialect, which means whole or unharmed. And the idea of calling this campaign Salima is to, by the words that the campaign uses, to reverse this stereotype that girls and women who are not cut are corrupt, promiscuous, dishonorable, and instead to project the idea that girls do not need this, and in fact that cutting is a kind of harming, and that girls and women without having this practice are salima, they're whole or unharmed. This was the motivating idea of the choice of this name. And the goal, of course, is to be able in a measurable and sustainable way to reduce the prevalence of this practice among girls and young women in Sudan, both for their interest of their autonomy and their health, their well-being. And you can see here this map at how common a practice it was even up until, and still is today. This is a map from 2018. So I think UNICEF was very careful not to imagine that you could, get rid of this practice or a deeply rooted cultural practice in a year or even 10 years, but they wanted to be able to make progress to help the lives of as many girls and women as they could. So here's an actor map that I made to show, based on the materials that I read, that would show in one image who the most important actors are, who has the most power on this issue of FGM. And I chose the scheme of concentric circles in order to put the girl at the center. So you see here that all of these actors are arrayed according to these three levels of family, village, and the national level, with some of these international actors straddling this barrier between national and international. Because the point is that we're talking about one actor in particular who we care about in this campaign, and that's the welfare of the girl herself. I chose shapes in this case, circles for individuals, rectangles, octagons, and diamonds for institutions. In this case, rectangles for we could call traditional institutions, diamonds for international institutions, and this octagon, which was a special council that was created on this issue. Colors, I use colors to designate women in this teal color here, men or mixed gender, and with this heather color, and then the further away, I choose these kind of pink color to designate actors who may or may not be Sudanese, in many cases are not. So let's think about IAFA. How do we pool information that we might have on our team or from these different documents about who has influence, who is accountable to whom, how favorable are they to our position, and how do we reach them? So influence, you see here, I add a little, my little lightning bolt with a note, right? So, for example, one of the justifications often used for FGM is that this is required in Islam, but this is to note that some of the Islamic schools and scholars are split by the question of whether this is a required practice under Islam or merely a recommended one. So that's an important thing to note. Another interesting piece of information to capture in the map is that midwives now in Sudan, according to the regulations of the Ministry of Social Welfare, have to take an oath to assume their duties, in which they promise not to conduct these practices. Another important piece of information, because they're the ones who are actually doing the cutting, the midwives and the local health workers. So you see how I used the emoji and the note there to add that information. Accountability. Now, you don't want to just draw arrows between everybody. In this case, I chose to only include lines and arrows of direct formal accountability, because we have in this case, everyone else has a kind of a range of informal powers, the village elders and the religious officials. And because we have these concentric circles, we can see visually that these actors are more likely to interact with each other than to interact with these international actors up here. So just having the concentric circles means you don't have to add as many lines in between as you would in the organogram schema. And then we could think about favorability. Okay, so now we have a group of people. We're talking about, okay, who's generally more accepting of this practice and more critical of it, or more in favor of girls' autonomy or less in favor of it. And so you can designate this by a series of dots. This is just one kind of visual language we could use, where the green dots mean people who are in favor of reducing this practice of FGM. Red are people who are more likely to resist. And yellow are people who can be on one side or the other, or we're not quite sure. And how do you know this? Well, again, you start with a series of hypotheses, sometimes with surveys data, sometimes with interviews, but often just with the kind of life experience of the people on the team. And you set this up as a way of prioritizing efforts. You say, okay, if we are hearing over and over again that, for example, the paternal grandmother, the mother of the father of the girl, has a really important role and is generally putting the most pressure to do the FGM practice, the circumcision ceremony, then that just helps you focus your attention. Okay, this is the family member who is, we hypothesize, is the most likely to resist. It might not be true. It's certainly not true in every case, and it might change over time. But this allows you to generate some hypotheses, which then you can either confirm or invalidate based on what you learn on the ground. And access, again, I like this idea of the keys. You don't have to have a note next to it, but these would be, for example, if I'm a UNICEF strategist, thinking about, okay, well, where do we have the strongest relationships now, today? If I'm thinking of this as a campaign planning exercise, okay, well, we know people very well with the Ministry of Education. We work with them, and therefore, at the village level, the institution that we have the most access to are not the elders or not the religious officials. It's the school, right? Okay, that's interesting. That creates a potential opportunity for us to plan an intervention around the schools, for example. And something else you want to do when you're mapping is note things you don't know, right? So, for example, we don't know to what degree the village elders are, more typically conservative or maybe neutral with regard to this practice. So we could put a question mark there or put a little note saying, a need to gather data. So the point is that a map should not ignore gaps, knowledge gaps. They should actually point them out and say, we don't know this, but we need to gather some data about this. So that's an actor map. Let's look at some process maps. So one of the insights from the literature is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Different communities within Sudan practice FGM at different times in the course of a girl's life. So here would be a process map of the steps of what we're mapping here is the decision-making process. When are the key decisions made? So we see, okay, well, first the woman has to become pregnant. Then typically what we understand is that it's the grandmother, often the paternal grandmother, who initiates the conversation, are we going to circumcise this child or not? That then there's a step in which female relatives, often other female relatives than the grandparents, assess, are there midwives available? Do we have the money to pay them, right? And these are factors that would affect their decision about whether or not to do the ceremony. And then we understand from the interviews, for example, that the mother has the final decision, but she often is under enormous pressure from the family and the community. So by doing this process mapping, we can see a couple things. First, we see how little power the girl has, almost none, and this is a baby girl we're talking about here, but even how little power the mother has, how much power is outside of her hands over this process. And we also see when the key moments are where a positive intervention could work, like at this point where the relatives are assessing by talking to the midwives how much it costs or whether they're available. And so these could be moments where in the cycle of decisions where we want to intervene. But then we have to ask the question, okay, these are the key moments. How do we access the decision makers in these moments? And that leads to another level of strategic discussion. But at least now we can see clearly what we think the typical process looks like. Again, this is a typical process. It could vary from place to place. Here's a different version of this process for adolescent girls. But again, the same thing is true. We want to find by mapping the step by step. Here we have the idea of a ceremonial season that the village elders announce, where all the girls of that age group who reach puberty will do the ceremony collectively. So that might be a key moment for an intervention, or the moment where families negotiate which of their daughters are going to participate. That could be a key moment, and again, helping us target our resources or target our attention at the key moments, and then we have to solve the problem. How do we intervene? But when and where to intervene or with whom is a helpful first step. Third, here we have the final use case where it's the older teenagers or young women who are being prepared for marriage, and again we have a slightly different process map because different decision makers are involved. In this case, we read that it is often the family of the suitor, the family of the husband-to-be, that requests the circumcision. And then there's this consultation process where we understand from the data that marriage brokers are asked to say, okay, well, what is how important is this to getting a husband right now? And if the marriage broker at that point says, actually, the trends are fewer and fewer girls are getting this, so it won't prevent your daughter from getting married if she doesn't get the procedure. So this is a critical moment. And then, of course, the family has to decide. And so you can look at this moment of family decision, this moment of consultation of the marriage broker as key places to intervene in this decision-making process. And again, asking the question, well, then how? How do we do it? So I hope you see how the mapping fits into this larger strategic planning of the campaign. So here's an actor map. Now, so we've done this actor mapping, process mapping, and now we're ready to plan a campaign. So we can see the same actors. In this case, we're going to add some new actors that we're going to create. In this case, a girls' club. So based on the strategic insight that where we have the most access at the village level is to the school, what UNICEF decided to do was create a series of girls' clubs which would be 15 to 20 girls each per school. And the girls themselves would elect a focal point and an assistant, like a backup. And those focal points and assistants would come together in one big training for 120 different schools. So 240 young girls would get trained by UNICEF, and they would go back to their schools and train the other girls in their girls' clubs. And then the girls' clubs together would do things like plan events and use art and singing and dialogue and the videos that have been recorded to raise awareness about Salima, about the importance of keeping girls whole and unharmed. So what good does this map do? Well, one of the things this map can be useful for, as you see, is it shows the campaign in one image, right? And it shows why we chose the campaign in the way that we did, because the girls' clubs are the closest to the girl, or to the individual girls we want to help, and we have the best access, right, to the education system. So it explains the theory of change, or a part of the theory of change, to partners, potential partners, funders, etc. But be careful of a couple of things. First, you want to make sure that you distinguish different types of actors with different shapes. You don't want to use circles, for example, all to designate media campaigns and government institutions and family institutions. So it's useful to have these different shapes like you see here. And you also want to try to be consistent. You'll notice that between the process maps and this actor map, the mother is in the blue circle here, and the girl is in the white circle, and the village elders are in this kind of heather-colored circle. And this, again, if you're putting multiple maps next to each other on the wall, it helps people make the connection between the two maps. Don't add too many lines. I see a lot of maps that just have way too many lines because they think that too many lines actually is confusing as opposed to helpful. So only add lines where you want to show something that isn't obvious. In this case, what's the connection what are the most important connections between the village level and the national level? Well, it's between the health workers and the health ministry, the social welfare ministry, and between the village school and the Ministry of Education, or between the religious officials in the village and these different religious institutions. So, that would just help clarify where are the pathways between the village level and the national level, for example. But you don't have to add lines, too many lines, otherwise it gets cluttered. And I'm happy to say that this very thoughtful and strategic campaign, it hasn't ended the practice, but it's made some progress in the welfare of girls and women in Sudan. So I hope this was a nice case to see how mapping works to help create a strategy to make society a little better, a little bit more healthy.